Hello, everyone, and welcome to this co-production of WION and Voice of America. I'm Susan Tehrani in New York City. We begin today with the end of the year spending battle on Capitol Hill, threatening the war efforts in Ukraine, aid to Israel, as well as funds to counter China. A second wartime winter has arrived in Ukraine, and the country is working to make sure this one is not as difficult as the one last year when Russian shelling caused severe damage to the power grid and heat delivery system. Anna Chernikova reports from Kyiv.
In 2022, Ukraine endured heavy damage to its energy infrastructure due to intense Russian shelling. Officials say about 50% of the energy infrastructure was hit, leaving millions of Ukrainians without heat and power for parts of the winter. Alexander Harchenko, director of Ukraine's Energy Industry Research Center, expects Russian forces to increase their attacks on the power grid and other targets again this year as temperatures plunge.
I think they are waiting a good for them time, and they believe that this good time is cold weather. And they are waiting a real cold weather to start this attack again.
Harchenko says Ukraine has drawn lessons from last winter.
We survived. And we spent this time in between these 7-8 months to restore our system with very deep focus on physical defense, air defense, restoration of service capabilities of the system for the people.
Petro Kotin, the president of Energoatom, Ukraine's largest power producer, says this winter the country is ready to generate and distribute power at full capacity despite Russian rocket attacks.
All 9 units we expect to be on grid, and we increase the protection of these units, physical protection.
Due to wartime security restrictions, officials are unable to disclose details of those protection measures. Kotin told VOA that while fighting this winter's challenges, Ukraine has also begun to implement a long-term energy security strategy. The country wants complete independence from Russian nuclear fuel, used for its Soviet-era WION-440 reactors. In September, fuel supplied by the US-based Westinghouse Electric Company was loaded onto one of the reactors for the first time. The plan is for it to replace Russian fuel completely in the near future.
And 440, it's like 16 reactors throughout Europe, and all of them are operated on the Russian fuel. And we started this process just to load Westinghouse fuel to these small reactors. We are 440.
While Ukraine aims to achieve full energy independence from Russia, its main concern now is to survive another winter as the Russian shelling of critical infrastructure intensifies. Anna Chernikova, VOA News, Kyiv.
VOA's Jessica Stone joins us now live from the White House. Hi, Jessica. We've been following the U.S. congressional debate over aid to Ukraine as well as Israel and Taiwan. Where do these discussions stand now?
Well, just to bring our audience up to speed here, $50 billion in that bill for Ukraine, $14 billion for Israel and the Palestinians. Most Republicans do support additional aid to Ukraine, but the position they're taking now in this Senate process is that unless there is additional not only border security, but immigration reform inside this bill, they are not going to support it. And so on Wednesday, every Republican in the U.S. Senate declined to move the what we're calling the emergency supplemental bill, which has all of these funds for foreign aid, into a place where it would be debated. And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer also voted against it, simply so that he could reintroduce it later. Now, U.S. President Joe Biden has been very clear that this needs to pass. He says Ukraine is about ready to run out of money by the end of the year. But even if it does pass the Senate, as you well know, Susan, it still has to pass the Republican-controlled House.
That's right, and lawmakers will spend their last days in Washington next week before the holidays. What are the odds that a deal could be reached before that?
Yeah, it's so hard to tell with these things, but I did take a look at just how frequently these last-minute deals come together. And Pew Research actually has done some research on this. Of course, the name is appropriate. End-of-year spending battles on Capitol Hill, their research suggests, are nothing new. In fact, look at this. In nearly 50 years, Congress has passed required funding bills on time just 4 times. So you and I, we've been in this situation many times before. I've been in Washington 15 years, and this is nothing new as a journalist. But here's the real issue. Lawmakers had tried to attach this Ukraine and Israel funding to each of the end-of-year spending bills that would fund the government. And each time, in September and then in November, they had to drop those measures in order to get the bill through. So that is why we're at this end-of-year situation where we do have the government funded through the beginning of next year, but we don't have a decision on critical aid to U.S. allies and to Ukraine and to Israel. Susan?
Yeah, so many nuances. Jessica, please stay with us. I want to go now to your report on the impact of this stalemate for U.S. funding to Pacific Island nations, as funding to counter China in the Pacific is now caught in the congressional battle in Washington over foreign aid and border security. The White House calls the package, quote, a crucial component of its national security strategy. And as VOA's Jessica Stone reports, time is running out to lock in an economic and security relationship between the U.S. and 3 strategic Pacific Island nations for the next 20 years.
Even as the U.S. military launched Operation Christmas Drop this week, delivering toys, gifts, and essential supplies to the people of Micronesia and Palau.
When is this a crisis?
Lawmakers in Washington blocked a bill that would renew economic aid to 3 key U.S. allies in the Pacific: Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau. The White House calls the aid critical to national security. Micronesia's former president David Panuelo agrees.
So we consider ourselves a part of the homeland security of the United States, even though we are a sovereign nation.
Panuelo says China is trying to change that, though Beijing denies any wrongdoing.
Your vice president was given envelopes of cash from the Chinese.
Correct, and he has disclosed that to me as one of the direct evidence. And so you can see that they are seeking influence.
In an agreement known as the Compacts of Free Association, Washington pays these nations $7.1 billion over 20 years for the right to build radar sites, test missiles, and to prevent China from entering a large swath of the Western Pacific. But those funds will only be approved if lawmakers on Capitol Hill reach agreement on border security.
For us, it's like there's a strategic interest. It's a U.S. Security interest. We are partners. Let's get this done.
Palau's president, Surangel Whips, tells VOA his country faces a $37 million budget shortfall. He says while U.S. lawmakers debate whether to approve these funds, Chinese officials are prepared to exploit any voids left behind by Washington.
Why inflict damage on the relationship and create distrust and all of that when, to me, it's just simple. We have an agreement. Let's move forward.
Approving the compact's funding has broad bipartisan support in Washington. Republican Congresswoman Michelle Steele says she supports it.
We really have to protect our allies, and we have to use that fund. That fund is, I believe about $7 billion. Right. It's a very, very important amount that we have to use for that area because China, my God, it's very dangerous.
Lawmakers are due to leave Washington December 15th. The question now, will they be delivering economic stability for these Pacific allies in time for Christmas? Jessica Stone, VOA News, Washington.
VOA's Jessica Stone is still with us from the White House. Jessica, what makes these islands so significant to the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy?
This is a really interesting question, Susan, because most Americans have no clue what happens on these islands, nor how important they are to U.S. national security. If you think about the conversations around additional maritime surveillance and over-the-horizon technology, these are buzzwords we've heard in Washington as people talk about not needing boots on the ground to surveil an area. The way that the U.S. is doing that is they're using radar sites, not only in Guam, but in Palau, the country that you heard the president of in that piece. And there are 2 radar sites. One of them is already under construction. One of them is about to be constructed in the Republic of Palau. And Palau, just for context, is about 1,500 kilometers from the Philippines. It is a 5-hour plane ride to Beijing. So it is very, very close to Asia. In 2022, the Pentagon awarded a $118 million contract to build what's known as this tactical mobile over-the-horizon radar in Palau. And it provides greater range, I'm told, by defense officials than line-of-sight radar. Then there's also the nearby Marshall Islands, which is one of these 3 countries that is in question in terms of the funding. It houses the all-important U.S. Army Kwajalein Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Defense Site. It is the target for the missiles that are launched from California, that are tested and that are integral to the U.S. defense and national security. It's also, by the way, a key center for the U.S. Space Force. Of course, this is a new part of the U.S. military stood up under President Trump, and there is a lot of interesting things going on in the Marshall Islands with respect to that as well.
And India has made deepening ties with these Pacific Island nations a foreign policy priority as well. How is this viewed in Washington?
Well, Washington is increasingly looking to its regional partners, including India, to help with this surveillance issue, to help with other issues, just having better eyes on the ground in this part of the world. And one of the things we know they've gone to India with, the Deputy National Security Advisor just got back, in fact, over the weekend from being in India, meeting with Indian officials. The U.S. actively asking India to purchase drones that are unarmed and unmanned for additional surveillance, but that can be integrated into the Indian military, and that data can be shared with the other Quad partners as well as other regional partners. And a top Pentagon official saying that this discussion just happened over the weekend again. Now, we know that analysts have told VOA repeatedly that the strategic competition in the region, it's not just between the U.S. and China, it's also increasingly between India and China and other major players in the region. But we also can tell you that joint health training was launched between the U.S. and India very recently, beginning in October, with some USAID funding for health professionals. And so this is obviously a part of the world that needs health care, that also needs emergency response, disaster response. There was that recent tsunami and earthquake. There is training going on between the U.S. and India, as reported actually by WION's own Sinan Sibal, to talk about increasing the cadence and the training that's given to health professionals in the island of Fiji. Also combating climate change, obviously a point where people can work together, and the UN and India, through some Indian funding, are working in Fiji on that issue as well. Susan?
Wow, Jessica, thank you so much for all of those analysis and updates. I hope you have a lovely weekend, and I look forward to speaking to you again next week. Thank you.